The mountains had learned how to keep quiet long before people arrived, and when the Calder Boy disappeared, they swallowed his name like a prayer spoken too late. For 40 years, Appalachia carried the story the way it carried fog, low, thick, and unwilling to lift. Children grew up hearing warnings instead of lullabies. Hunters avoided certain hollows without knowing why. Old men flinched when the wind pressed against their windows at night, as if something was knocking from the wrong side of time. They called him the Calder Boy because no one could agree on his first name anymore. It slipped through conversations, changed shape, and finally dissolved into something safer to forget. He vanished one autumn evening when the trees bled rust and gold, leaving behind a shoe by the creek and a silence that never quite healed. Search parties came and went. Dogs lost the scent at the tree line. The mountain offered nothing back but echoes. When the call came 4 decades later, it didn't sound like hope. It sounded like a mistake correcting itself. The men who went looking this time felt it immediately, the way the woods leaned in, listening. The air grew colder with every step into the hollow marked on the old map, a place locals pretended didn't exist. No birds sang there. No insects moved. Even their radios hissed with a low, steady breath, like something sleeping just beneath the soil. They found signs that shouldn't have survived, boot prints pressed into stone, rope fibers that hadn't rotted, a fire ring still dusted with ash that scattered like fresh powder when touched. Time behaved differently there, bending, thinning, as if the mountain had folded one year over another and pinned them together. Then they found him. He stood beneath a canopy of twisted branches, barefoot, wearing clothes stitched from fabric no one recognized. His hair was dark, his face unlined, his eyes far too old. He did not look frightened. He looked relieved, as if the world had finally remembered its part. No one spoke his name. They didn't have to. When asked how he survived, the boy smiled faintly and shook his head, as though the question itself was wrong. He asked instead if the town still rang the church bell on Sundays, if the river still flooded every spring, if the cemetery still had stones without names. Each question landed heavier than the last. On the walk back, the forest began to change. Trees bowed inward. Paths shifted. The men felt watched by something patient and intimate, something that knew the sound of their breathing. The Calder Boy walked as if guided, never stumbling, never slowing, his bare feet finding ground where none seemed solid. At the edge of the hollow, just before the signal returned and the modern world rushed back in, the boy finally spoke the truth they had unknowingly come to retrieve. He said the town had not lost him. He said they had given him away. And he said what was promised in return was coming back with him. The decayed map surfaced the way old sins often do, not with ceremony but with inconvenience, folded inside a rusted lunch pail found during the clearing of a condemned farmhouse on the edge of town. The house had belonged to a man who never spoke of the past and died without heirs, and when the floorboards were lifted, the smell of mold gave way to a thinner, sharper odor, like iron and wet leaves. Inside the pail lay a map so fragile it flaked at the creases, its ink bled into veins that resembled roots rather than roads. What drew attention was not the map itself, but the way certain places were scratched out and rewritten, as if someone had changed their mind while being watched. Tucked beside it was a photograph, the only one anyone had ever seen of the Calder Boy after his disappearance. The image showed a child standing at the mouth of a wooded path, half his face lost to shadow, eyes fixed on the person holding the camera with an expression too deliberate for his age. On the back, in cramped handwriting, were the words "Last light before the hollow," followed by a date that did not match any official record. When the map and photograph were placed together, the lines aligned with disturbing precision, the path in the photo matching a narrow, unnamed trail marked on the map that led into terrain long avoided by locals. Older residents recognized the hand-drawn symbols scattered along the route, marks once carved into fence posts and trees before being quietly removed. Each symbol corresponded to a place where something had gone missing: livestock, tools, even people whose names were now spoken only in whispers. The discovery reopened questions no one wanted answered, especially the detail that the trail did not end where the boy was reported lost, but continued far deeper into the mountains, terminating at a hollow absent from all county records. The photograph suggested he had not wandered aimlessly, but had been guided, positioned, perhaps even prepared. When light struck the image at a certain angle, another shape appeared behind him, tall and blurred, its outline inconsistent with any human form, as if the camera had captured movement that the eye refused to acknowledge. The map, once dismissed as meaningless scrawl, became a confession written in paper and wrought, pointing not to where the Calder boy vanished, but to where he was meant to go, implying a decision made by more than a frightened child on an autumn evening, and suggesting that the search 40 years ago had followed the wrong direction by design, guided away from the truth and buried beneath officially sanctioned forgetting. The campsite was found after a full day of hiking through terrain that should not have allowed anything to remain intact, let alone something abandoned for 40 years. It lay in a shallow basin where the trees grew in a crooked circle, their trunks bent inward as if leaning to observe whatever rested at the center. The ground there felt firm underfoot, unnaturally so, resisting the soft decay common to the surrounding forest. At first glance, the site appeared recent, the kind of place a drifter or hunter might have used the night before, but the deeper they looked, the more time unraveled. A fire ring sat perfectly formed, its stones blackened but uncracked, ash still pale and powdery as though heat had touched it only hours earlier. Nearby, a bed of flattened leaves held the faint impression of a small body, the edges of the leaves browned but not broken down, preserved in a way that defied seasons of rain and frost. A tin cup rested on its side beside a log, its surface dulled but free of rust, catching light in a way that felt deliberate, almost inviting. The smell was wrong too, not the rich rot of old forest floor but something cleaner, colder, tinged with smoke that lingered in the throat. Instruments and watches malfunctioned within the basin, seconds stretching, minutes slipping, making it difficult to track how long they had been there. One man swore he heard footsteps circling the site, light and barefoot, stopping whenever he turned to look. Another noticed carvings on the surrounding trees, shallow but precise, matching the symbols from the recovered map, each cut sharp enough to look newly made yet weathered enough to suggest decades of exposure. The unsettling realization settled in that this place had not been abandoned but held, suspended in a state of waiting. Nothing grew over the campsite, no moss crept across the stones, no insects nested in the crevices, as if life itself avoided disturbing what had been arranged. When soil samples were taken, they showed no signs of organic breakdown, layers of earth compacted as though pressed by unseen weight over many years. The men began to speak in lowered voices without realizing why, every sound carrying too far in the stillness. As they prepared to leave, one of them noticed a faint line of footprints leading away from the basin, child-sized, clear and sharp, vanishing at the tree line where the forest resumed its normal decay. The prints were too perfect, not softened by time or weather, pointing not backward toward the past, but forward, deeper into the mountains, suggesting that the campsite was not a relic of survival, but a threshold, a place where time paused so that something could remain exactly as it was meant to be, waiting for the moment it would be found. The warnings began quietly, almost politely, the way mountain folk preferred to handle dangerous truths. It started with a woman at the general store who stopped speaking when the search team entered, her eyes flicking toward the windows as if the hills themselves might overhear. An old man pumping gas told them the trail they were following had no name because names gave places permission to be remembered. Another said the Calder boy had never been lost, only misplaced by people who wanted to keep breathing. Each comment seemed casual, delivered with a shrug or a thin smile, yet carried the weight of something rehearsed over generations. The deeper the search pushed into public conversation, the more the town stiffened, like a body bracing for pain it had learned to endure. Church elders requested private meetings, urging the men to let the mountains rest, insisting that disturbing certain hollows invited consequences that did not end with a single person. They spoke in parables rather than facts, telling stories of families who prospered without explanation and others who vanished after asking the wrong questions. One woman claimed her grandmother had been present the night the boy disappeared and had locked herself in her room for 3 days afterward, praying aloud for forgiveness she never explained. The warnings grew sharper when the team announced their intention to follow the map's marked trail. A handwritten note appeared on a windshield, the paper yellowed and smelling faintly of smoke, reading simply that some children were chosen, not taken. A retired deputy, his voice unsteady, admitted the original search had been redirected more than once by orders from above, men in suits who arrived before dawn and left without names. He said the town had been told where not to look, and everyone obeyed because the alternative was unthinkable. As dusk fell, dogs began barking across the valley in uneven waves, a sound that locals recognized as a bad sign, though no one would say why. The implication settled heavily over the team that the Calder Boy's disappearance had served a purpose, one the community understood well enough to protect with silence. The mountains, it seemed, were not the only ones keeping secrets. When a storm rolled in that night without warning, lightning striking the ridges but leaving the town untouched, an elderly preacher finally spoke the truth in a voice barely above a whisper. He said the boy had been hidden because being found was worse than being gone. He said the hollow demanded balance, and once it was given, it did not like to be reminded of what it was owed. The searchers realized then that they were not uncovering a mystery but reopening an agreement, and every warning they had received was not meant to stop them out of cruelty or superstition, but out of fear of what would happen if the Calder Boy was ever brought back into the light. The first sound was dismissed as wind slipping through stone, a long, hollow exhale that rose and fell without rhythm, but it returned every night at the same hour, threading itself between the trees like a voice learning how to speak. It seemed to move with intention, circling the search perimeter, stopping just beyond the reach of lantern light. Those who heard it described it differently, a child humming off-key, bare feet scuffing leaves, breath drawn too close to the ear, yet all agreed it carried a familiarity that made the skin tighten. Alongside the sounds came the markings, appearing where none had been before, carved into bark, pressed into mud, etched faintly into stones as if by fingernail or bone. The symbols matched sketches buried in old police files, shapes officials once labeled meaningless to close reports faster, spirals broken by sharp angles, lines intersecting like ribs around an absent heart. Seeing them again unsettled the men who had studied those yellowed pages, because the marks were exact, down to imperfections only visible when enlarged decades earlier. They began finding the symbols at the edges of their camp, always facing inward, always positioned at eye level, suggesting not warning but observation. Each morning revealed more, never overlapping, never repeated too closely, as if whatever placed them understood spacing and patience. Radios crackled with static when carried near the marks, batteries draining faster, compasses tilting away from true north as though the ground itself objected to being measured. One night, a low tapping joined the breath-like sound, slow and deliberate, echoing from different points, mimicking the signal patterns described in the original investigation, notes exchanged between officers too embarrassed to admit they were afraid. When a younger searcher traced one symbol with his glove, his fingers tingled, numbness spreading up his arm until the mark was left untouched, respected like a wound. Reviewing the old files by lantern light revealed a detail overlooked for years, that the symbols had been recorded weeks before the boy officially vanished, suggesting preparation rather than aftermath. That realization shifted the fear from the unknown to the inevitable. The sounds grew closer after that, sometimes forming patterns, 3 short breaths followed by one long, identical to descriptions given by a witness who recanted the next day and left town before sunrise. Sleep became shallow and fragmented, dreams bleeding into waking moments where shadows lingered too long and silence felt crowded. The team understood then that the hollow was responding to their presence, not angrily, but attentively, replaying its old language, reminding them it had been listening for 40 years and had not forgotten how to speak to those who came looking, using the same symbols, the same sounds, because the message had never changed. The journal was found wrapped in oilcloth beneath a slab of stone too heavy for a child to move alone, yet positioned with care as though meant to be uncovered at a precise moment. Its pages were thin and brittle, the cover darkened by moisture and time, but the binding held, resisting decay the way everything else in the hollow seemed to. When opened, the handwriting immediately unsettled the men who read it, uneven and childlike yet disturbingly controlled, each letter pressed hard into the paper as if written with urgency and restraint at the same time. The early entries described ordinary things, hunger, cold nights, the sounds of animals moving beyond sight, but threaded through them were observations no lost child should possess, detailed descriptions of weather shifts before they occurred, of visitors who arrived without footsteps, of voices that spoke without mouths. Dates appeared sporadically, some repeating, others skipping years entirely, written as though time was something the writer stepped in and out of rather than endured. One entry mentioned the search parties by name, listing men who would not be born for decades, noting the exact phrases they would later speak aloud when fear finally loosened their tongues. Another page described the symbols carved into trees before they were ever discovered, explaining their placement with the calm authority of instruction rather than record. The tone of the journal never wavered into panic, even when describing pain. Instead it read like testimony given under oath, factual, deliberate, stripped of emotion. The boy wrote about learning the Hollow's rules, about how certain questions could not be asked and certain paths could not be walked twice, about how promises were heavier than chains. Several pages were devoted to the town itself, recounting conversations overheard miles away, church meetings held in secrecy, bargains struck in language that avoided naming what was being offered. The most disturbing passages spoke of watching people age from a distance, recognizing children who would grow old while he remained unchanged, noting how grief settled differently on each family depending on how much they knew. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, the last line trailing off into a smudge where the ink had been pressed too hard, as if the writer had been interrupted or had reached a point beyond which writing was no longer permitted. Holding the journal, the searchers realized it was not a diary meant for comfort or survival, but a record demanded by something that required memory to be preserved accurately, proof that the Calder boy had not simply endured 40 years in the wilderness, but had been educated by it, shaped into a witness who understood far more about the town, the mountains, and the cost of silence than anyone who had ever gone looking for him. They found him at dawn, where the hollow narrowed into a pocket of stone and twisted roots that should not have held space enough for a man, let alone a life sustained for 4 decades. The entrance was half hidden by briars that parted without resistance, revealing a chamber sealed from weather and light, its walls smoothed as if by patient hands. He stood there calmly, not startled by voices or lanterns, as though he had been expecting them at that precise moment. What struck them first was not that he was alive, but that he was unchanged. His face carried the softness of boyhood, unmarked by years, his posture straight and unburdened, his skin unlined and pale as if time had passed around him rather than through him. His eyes, however, told a different story, deep-set and steady, holding a weight of knowing that made grown men avert their gaze. He wore clothes fashioned from rough fabric stitched with meticulous care, seams reinforced, patterns repeated, garments made to last rather than age. No gray touched his hair. No tremor touched his hands. Instruments confirmed what sight refused to accept, a heartbeat slow but strong, breath measured, body temperature steady, every sign of life present yet disconnected from chronology. The space around him felt sealed, sound muted, air dense, as if the hollow itself resisted intrusion. He did not ask who they were. He did not ask why they had come. Instead, he greeted them by name, including 2 men who had joined the search only days earlier, watching their faces as recognition turned to fear. When one stepped forward instinctively, the ground beneath shifted slightly, a warning subtle enough to be dismissed until repeated. The boy smiled then, not warmly, but with practiced gentleness, as though comforting someone weaker. He said he could leave now because the counting was done, because the mountain had finished listening. When asked how he survived, he answered that survival was not the right word, that he had been kept. He gestured to the stone walls, explaining they were closed the night he arrived and had not opened again until that morning. He spoke of years passing outside like weather he observed but did not feel, of seasons measured by sound rather than sight. The men noticed then that no dust clung to his feet, no dirt marked his clothes, as though the earth itself refused to claim him. As they guided him toward the light, the hollow exhaled, a low vibration rippling through the roots and rock, and for a moment it felt as if something immense had shifted its attention elsewhere, releasing what it had held intact for 40 years not as an act of mercy, but because the purpose of keeping him exactly as he was had finally been fulfilled. He spoke the name as they crossed the tree line, quietly, almost casually, as if testing whether it still belonged to the world outside the hollow. The effect was immediate and visceral, like a stone dropped into still water. One of the older men staggered as though struck, another removed his hat without realizing why, lips moving in a prayer learned too young. The name had not been spoken aloud in town for decades, scrubbed from records, omitted from sermons, erased from gravestones by careful hands under the excuse of weathering. Children were taught never to ask about it, and those who remembered learned to swallow it whole, because saying it invited attention. Hearing it again, in that voice untouched by age, cracked something open that had been sealed by fear and routine. When word reached town that evening, it moved faster than reason, passed from porch to porch, carried in lowered voices that shook despite their caution. Elders gathered without being called, faces drawn tight, hands trembling as they poured coffee they did not drink. Some denied what they had heard, insisting the boy must have misspoken, that memory had played tricks, but others knew better, because the name was pronounced correctly, with the old emphasis no one used anymore. One woman fainted at the sound of it. A man who had not left his house in 10 years was seen walking toward the church, barefoot and weeping. Panic did not arrive loudly, but it spread like frost, stiffening movement, clouding judgment. The elders argued behind locked doors, voices rising, accusations resurfacing after years of enforced peace. They had believed time itself would bury the truth, that forgetting was a form of protection, but the Calder boy had carried the name intact, preserved the way the hollow preserved him. The name belonged to someone once central to the town's survival, a figure officially dismissed as myth after a fire destroyed the original courthouse records. Speaking it threatened to unravel carefully maintained explanations for prosperity that came without effort, for tragedies that spared certain families and claimed others without pattern. The boy explained calmly that he had learned the name early, that it had been given to him the night he was brought into the mountains, spoken with reverence and fear by people who would later swear it had never existed. He said the name was a door, and doors required witnesses. As elders listened from the shadows, they realized the bargain they had made depended on silence, and silence had been broken not by outsiders or time, but by the very thing they believed they had hidden. The name moved through the town like a returning memory, impossible to stop, waking guilt in some and relief in others, because it meant the waiting was over and the cost they thought had been paid in advance was about to be collected in full. When he finally explained the bargain, it was not done with accusation or anger, but with the careful neutrality of someone reciting terms that could not be renegotiated. He spoke in a quiet room under the church, a place built of stone older than the town's name, where echoes lingered too long and secrets felt heavier than sound. The elders sat across from him, faces drawn and pale, recognizing phrases they had sworn never to repeat. The bargain, he said, was born of desperation during a winter when the mines collapsed, crops failed, and sickness moved faster than prayer. The town had gathered and asked the hollow for protection, not knowing whether it was a place or something listening beneath it. What answered them did not demand gold or blood, but balance, a living witness removed from time so the debt could be measured rather than endlessly repaid. The Calder boy had been chosen because he was young enough to endure the separation and forgotten easily enough to preserve the lie. They were told he would not suffer, that he would be kept whole, untouched by hunger, illness, or age, as long as the town upheld its silence. In return, disasters would pass them by, floods would stop short, fires would change direction, and the mountain would take only what was offered. The boy confirmed every part of it, describing the night he was brought to the hollow, the words spoken, the hands that pushed him forward while promising it was for everyone's good. He said the hollow counted time through him. Each year he remained unchanged, a year the bargain held. But bargains, he explained, were not eternal, only patient. When people began to forget why they were protected, when gratitude turned into entitlement, the balance shifted. He said the hollow had listened as the town prospered and denied the cost, rewriting history until the sacrifice became a myth. That was when the counting ended. His return was not punishment, but accounting. The bargain required the truth to be carried back into the world, because lies, once complete, broke the agreement. The elders asked what would happen next, their voices thin with fear, and he told them nothing they hadn't already agreed to long ago. Protection would be withdrawn. What had been diverted would resume its natural course. The hollow would no longer hold what did not belong to it. He made it clear that his survival was never the gift, silence was. Now that silence was gone, the town would have to face what it had avoided, without intervention, without balance artificially maintained. As he spoke, the walls seemed to creak, not in threat, but in release, and the men and women who had once believed themselves saviors understood they had been caretakers of a debt, and that by allowing themselves to forget the bargain, they had ensured its most unforgiving clause would finally be enforced. The cost did not announce itself with catastrophe at first, but with small, unmistakable corrections, as if reality were adjusting its ledger. The creek that had never flooded began to creep over its banks, not violently, just enough to reclaim land long taken for granted. A minor rockslide closed the mine road for the first time in living memory, exposing rot in tunnels once praised as miracles of safety. People noticed illnesses lingering instead of lifting, crops failing in patches that mirrored old maps of offered land. None of it was sudden enough to point at, yet together it formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Those who remembered the bargain felt it immediately, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense of being watched not with malice but expectation. The Calder Boy remained in town, moving quietly through streets, his presence coinciding with each unraveling thread. Wherever he passed, memories surfaced, arguments long buried, names spoken without permission. Families once shielded from loss found themselves facing it in ordinary, human ways, accidents, misfortune, choices finally carrying weight. The elders attempted damage control, organizing prayers, rebuilding old rituals without understanding their purpose, but nothing held. The protection had not been taken away in anger, it had simply expired. The mountain resumed its indifference, which proved far more terrifying than any curse. Old records resurfaced from private collections, contradicting official histories, revealing patterns of who had benefited and who had paid in quiet ways. The truth spread unevenly, shattering some households while offering grim clarity to others who had always suspected. The Calder Boy explained that the cost was never meant to be collected all at once, that the agreement had ensured slow, bearable consequences rather than sudden collapse. Now, without balance, everything would arrive at its natural time. He warned that attempts to restore the bargain would fail, because it depended on willing remembrance, not fear-driven repentance. As the town struggled, people began leaving, not in panic, but with resignation, understanding that prosperity without context had hollowed them out. Those who stayed learned to live without exemption, to face storms and sickness like everyone else beyond the mountains. The boy was seen less frequently as the weeks passed, not vanishing, but blending into the background, his role complete. What returned was not a monster or vengeance, but accountability, the weight of cause and effect long deferred. In that way, the cost proved more devastating than any single disaster, because it forced the town to confront itself without illusion, to rebuild or fail honestly, knowing that what had once been buried for survival had come back not to destroy them, but to ensure that nothing like it could ever be hidden again. The truth that emerged from the Calder Boy's return did not arrive as a single revelation but as a cascade, each fragment heavier than the last, threatening to collapse the carefully constructed narrative of the town. Families who had prided themselves on their lineage discovered discrepancies in birth records, deeds, and wills, as if the very history of ownership and survival had been rewritten to protect secrets long thought buried. Monuments in the cemetery that had stood for generations without inscription now seemed hollow, the stones shifting subtly underfoot, some revealing names no one remembered hearing, others exposing erasures that contradicted every story ever told about who had lived and who had perished. Conversations that had been safe for decades suddenly became dangerous, casual recollections turned into confessions, and whispers spread faster than the light, fueled by fear and curiosity alike. Those who had been complicit in keeping the bargain, elders, town officials, even some families who had benefited from the hollow's protection, were forced to reckon with what they had silenced. The Calder Boy, calm and unwavering, moved among them, a living ledger of memories, repeating facts, names, and events with such precision that there could be no denial. Children who had grown up thinking the past was straightforward realized that the stories they had been told were fragments, selective glimpses designed to obscure responsibility and debt. Natural events that had once seemed inexplicable now appeared as consequences of choices made generations prior, as if the mountain itself was revealing the accounting long withheld. Fear turned to obsession, and obsession to revelation, as the town struggled to reconcile the man-child who had been hidden in their midst with the life they had continued believing was theirs alone. Some sought to leave, unable to endure the weight of truths too uncomfortable to carry. Others stayed, compelled to witness the unraveling and perhaps make peace with it, though how peace could exist under such scrutiny was uncertain. Patterns of betrayal, protection, and unspoken compacts became painfully clear, each thread connecting to the next until the fabric of the town's collective memory was stretched thin, fraying at the edges. It was not only history that was under threat but identity itself. The people who believed they knew who they were realized that everything depended on omissions, half-truths, and deliberate forgetfulness. As the Calder boy moved quietly through streets, houses, and fields, he seemed both observer and arbiter, not punishing, but ensuring that nothing remained hidden, that the town could no longer claim ignorance as refuge. By the time the first snows fell over Appalachia that year, every family, every household, and every individual who had been touched by the Hollow's bargain understood that the past was no longer safe to ignore, and that what had been buried with him had returned not only to be remembered, but to demand acknowledgement, a reckoning that the town could neither postpone nor escape.